I dragged my suitcase up the narrow staircase, each step groaning under the weight of my bag and my own exhaustion. The hostel wasn't much, just chipped paint, a faint smell of detergent clinging to the air, and the low hum of a vending machine somewhere down the hall, but it was cheap and that was enough. The room was smaller than I'd imagined. 2 metal bunk beds, one already occupied with a backpack and some folded clothes. A thin curtain hung limp across the window, letting in the glow of the street lamp outside. Shadows stretched long and soft against the walls. I took the lower bunk, sat down, and felt the springs creak beneath me. My roommate wasn't there yet. I pictured a stranger stumbling in at midnight, awkward introductions, then the careful dance of sharing a room with someone you don't know. I thought that would be the hardest part of the trip, this feeling of forced proximity with people who didn't matter. Hours later the door opened. I looked up from my phone expecting the roommate, but it wasn't him. A taller figure stepped in carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His hair was messy, like he'd been caught in the wind, and he had the kind of tired eyes that suggested he hadn't planned to be here. "Hey," he said softly, closing the door behind him. His voice was low, almost careful. "You must be my brother's roommate." I blinked, sitting up a little. "Brother?" He set the bag down by the empty bunk. "Yeah. He's staying here too, but I guess he's out right now. I'm crashing with you guys for a while." It took a moment for that to sink in. I nodded, trying not to stare, though my eyes betrayed me. His presence filled the room without trying. Broad shoulders under a plain black t-shirt. The faint sound of his shoes against the old floorboards as he moved. He didn't look like the kind of guy who belonged in a cramped hostel room, yet here he was, rolling his sleeves up casually like it was the most natural thing in the world. I muttered something polite, "Yeah sure, no problem," and watched him settle in. He didn't talk much, just unpacked a few things and placed them neatly on the shelf by his bed. I noticed the way his hands moved, slow and deliberate, like he didn't waste energy on unnecessary motion. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy. I could hear the faint sounds of the city outside, a car passing, voices drifting from the street. He glanced at me once, and in that brief meeting of eyes, something shifted. I looked away too quickly, pretending to adjust my blanket. He climbed onto the top bunk opposite mine. The metal frame rattled slightly under his weight. For a moment I thought he might say something else, but he just exhaled, a soft sigh that seemed to carry the whole day with it. I lay down, facing the wall, though my thoughts weren't anywhere near sleep. I could feel him there, just a few feet above me, the air in the room subtly different now. My heart thudded faster than it should have for no reason I could explain. When the lights went out, the glow from the street lamp filled the room with a pale silver wash. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't help listening. The shift of sheets, the faint rhythm of his breathing. It was steady, grounding, yet every inhale drew my attention tighter, like an invisible thread pulling me toward him. I turned on my side, facing the window. Through the thin curtain, the night spilled in quietly, pressing shadows across the wall. My mind replayed the moment he'd looked at me, the way his eyes lingered an instant too long. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I wanted to. There was something strange about the nearness of another person in the dark. A person I barely knew, yet whose presence felt loud in my chest. It wasn't attraction, not yet, not something I was willing to name. It was just awareness, acute and restless. The bunk creaked above me. I froze, listening, wondering if he was shifting in his sleep or still awake like I was. My breath caught in my throat, though there was no reason for it. Just two strangers sharing a room, nothing more. And yet, as the silence deepened, I couldn't shake the thought. I wasn't alone anymore. He was right there, so close that the space between us felt smaller than it was, like one wrong move could erase it entirely. I let my eyes fall shut, though my body stayed tense, waiting for nothing. In that hush, I thought I could hear him exhale again, softer this time, almost like a sigh that matched my own. And the room, once so empty, felt suddenly full. Morning came too soon. The curtain let in a pale slice of daylight, enough to paint the walls in soft gray. I woke to the sound of movement, the rustle of fabric, the faint scrape of a zipper. When I blinked the sleep from my eyes, he was there, standing at the foot of his bunk. His back was to me, his shirt lifted halfway as he pulled it over his head. The gesture was casual, thoughtless, but it froze me. His shoulders caught the light in a way that made every line sharper, every detail more impossible to ignore. I rolled onto my side, pretending to adjust my pillow, as if that could disguise the fact that my pulse had suddenly picked up. He shook his head once, messy strands of hair falling into his face, then tossed the shirt onto his bed. "You're up early," I said, my voice rough with sleep. He glanced at me, faintly surprised, before giving a small shrug. Couldn't sleep much. His tone was easy but his eyes didn't linger long. He reached for another shirt from his bag, tugged it on and sat down on the edge of the bunk. The silence returned, the same silence from the night before, stretched taut between us like an invisible wire. I sat up, pulling my blanket around my shoulders even though it wasn't cold. "You're staying long?" I asked, unsure why I needed to fill the space with words. "Not sure," he replied. "Depends on how things go." He rubbed the back of his neck, a small, almost nervous motion. Then he smiled faintly as if to soften the vagueness of his answer. Something about that half-smile caught me off guard. It was small, almost unintentional, but it stayed with me. I dropped my gaze, tracing the seam of the blanket with my thumb. The rest of the day passed in fragments. His brother came and went, always loud, always filling the space with chatter, which almost made me forget the quiet tension that lived between us when we were alone. Almost. That evening, when the room emptied again, I found him sitting on the floor by his bunk, scrolling through his phone. His legs were stretched out, crossed at the ankles, his body angled toward the light from the window. I hesitated before speaking. "Long day." He looked up, eyes catching mine briefly before he nodded. "Yeah. Yours?" "Pretty much the same." I sat on my bed, my hands restless in my lap. The words weren't remarkable, but the weight behind them was. Every glance, every pause carried more than the conversation itself. After a while, I lay back, staring at the ceiling, though my focus kept sliding to the faint reflection of his profile in the windowpane. The curve of his jaw, the way he leaned into the wall with one arm. He shifted suddenly, standing and stretching, his shirt lifting just enough to reveal a strip of skin at his waist. I looked away too quickly, my throat tightening. "Sorry," he said, though for what, I wasn't sure. I blinked. "For what?" "For crowding you, maybe?" His voice had dropped lower, gentler. "You're not," I said too quickly. Then softer, "It's fine." His eyes lingered on me a second longer than they needed to. Then he gave a quiet nod, almost like he accepted an unspoken truth, and climbed onto his bunk. Later, in the dark, I lay awake listening again. The rhythm of his breathing had become familiar, yet every inhale still pulled at something inside me. I wondered if he was asleep or if he too was staring into the dark, avoiding the questions he didn't have the courage to ask. I thought of the way his voice had softened when he said sorry, the way his smile had flickered earlier, half-formed but real. And even though nothing had been said, not really, I felt it. Something had shifted even if neither of us dared to name it. That night, the room was quieter than usual. Even the city outside seemed muted, as if the streets had emptied themselves of sound. His brother hadn't come back yet, leaving just the two of us in the half-lit room. I was sitting on my bed, pretending to read something on my phone, when he climbed down from the top bunk. The metal frame rattled softly under his weight. He didn't say anything at first, just crossed the space and lowered himself onto the edge of my bed. My breath caught. The mattress dipped beneath him, pulling me closer by inches. My pulse stumbled in my chest. "Hope you don't mind," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the floor. I shook my head, though words felt lodged in my throat. "It's fine." For a while we just sat there, the silence thick enough to feel like a third presence between us. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his hands hanging loosely. The glow from the street lamp through the curtain caught the lines of his profile. His jaw, the curve of his lips, the slight furrow between his brows. "You ever feel like," he trailed off, searching, "like you're not sure where you're supposed to be?" The question hung in the air, heavier than I expected. I swallowed, my throat dry. "All the time." He glanced at me then, and for the first time his eyes didn't look away. They stayed, steady and unflinching, like he was trying to read something in me he hadn't dared to before. Something shifted. The air between us tightened, humming with a strange energy I couldn't name. I felt my body tense, not from fear but from the unbearable awareness of how close he was. I dropped my gaze to my hands, but then his brushed against mine. Just barely, an accident maybe, or maybe not. I froze. Time seemed to stretch, every detail magnified. The warmth of his skin, the soft scrape of fabric against fabric, the quiet catch of my breath. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. It was nothing. Just the faintest touch. But it rooted me to the spot, like the world had narrowed down to that single point of contact. The silence grew heavier, though not empty, more like it was filled with something unspoken, pressing at the edges of my chest. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Finally he shifted, his hand retreating as casually as it had come. He leaned back slightly, exhaling a breath that sounded almost like a laugh but wasn't. "Sorry," he murmured. I wanted to say don't be, but the words caught in my throat. He stood after that, climbing back onto his bunk with the same quiet ease, leaving me staring at my hands like they held a secret I couldn't share. When the lights went out, I lay in the dark, replaying it over and over. The brush of his skin against mine, the look in his eyes before it happened, the way the air had felt charged with something neither of us could admit. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, my chest tight with restless energy. I told myself it was nothing, just an accident, just a moment. But I knew I was lying. Because the truth was that single touch had stopped me cold, frozen me in place, and I wasn't sure I'd ever move past it. Sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay in the dark, restless, my body aware of every sound, every shift from the bunk above me. The faint rhythm of his breathing was steady at first, then uneven, as if he was turning over and over just like I was. When the silence stretched too long, I whispered into it. "Are you awake?" There was a pause, then the faint creak of the mattress. "Yeah." His voice was low, husky from disuse, as though it had been sitting in his chest all night. Something in me tightened. "Can't sleep?" He exhaled a laugh, small and strained. "Guess not." The room felt different suddenly, too small, too charged. I shifted, the blanket pulling with me, and before I could think better of it, I asked, "Want to talk?" Another pause. Then the sound of the bunk creaking again as he climbed down. My heart stumbled, caught somewhere between anticipation and fear. He crossed the room with quiet steps and sat beside me, the same way he had earlier. The mattress dipped, pulling me closer. The glow from the street lamp painted his face in pale silver. He looked tired, but not in the way sleep could fix. "You ever feel like you're pretending?" he asked suddenly, his voice rough. "Like you've got everyone convinced you're fine, but inside you're just waiting for something?" The words sank into me heavy and sharp. I didn't trust myself to answer at first. My throat felt dry, my chest too tight. "Yes," I whispered finally. He turned his head, his eyes finding mine in the dim light. There was no smile this time, no attempt to hide. Just raw honesty. "I don't even know why I came here," he said. "I told myself it was to see my brother, to get away for a while. But I think I was just running." His hand fidgeted against the blanket, close enough that the heat of it brushed my skin. I couldn't move. "You don't have to tell me," I said softly. "But running from what?" He looked at me for a long time, like he was deciding if he could trust me with the answer. Then he exhaled. "From myself, mostly." The words cracked something open inside me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to reach for him, to close the space, but I stayed still, every muscle tense with restraint. "I get that," I said. And I meant it. More than I wanted to admit. His gaze lingered, searching, and in that silence something shifted again, like the ground beneath us had tilted and there was no going back. "Can I ask you something?" he murmured. "Of course." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Back there, earlier, when our hands—" he trailed off, shaking his head like the words wouldn't come. "Did you feel it too?" My chest ached. My breath caught. The easy answer would have been denial, to laugh it off, to pretend. But the truth pressed against my lips, desperate to be said. "Yes." His eyes widened, not with surprise but with something else. Something like relief, like fear dissolving into possibility. Silence pressed down on us, but it wasn't empty. It was alive, electric. He leaned closer, not enough to touch, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "What if I said—" his voice trembled, faltered, then steadied. "What if I said I've been thinking about it?" "About you?" My throat tightened. "Then I'd say I've been thinking about you too." The words felt dangerous, terrifying, but once they were out, I couldn't take them back. I didn't want to. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, like testing the edge of a fragile glass, he lifted his hand and let it hover near mine. I didn't wait this time. I closed the space, our fingers brushing, then tangling softly, tentatively. It was nothing and everything at once, just the warmth of his hand in mine, but it felt like a door had opened that could never be shut again. He leaned in, so close I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the way his lips parted as if to speak. But no words came. Instead, he pressed his forehead gently to mine. The contact was soft, trembling, but it said more than either of us could have put into words. My breath hitched, my chest heavy with something equal parts fear and relief. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, forehead to forehead, hand in hand, breathing each other in. When he finally pulled back, his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what this means." "Me neither," I admitted. "But I don't want it to stop." His eyes softened, the tension in his face melting into something warm, fragile, unguarded. He gave the smallest nod, like he understood without needing more explanation. And in that quiet, trembling moment, something new began, terrifying and fragile but real in a way I couldn't deny. I don't remember how long we stayed like that, leaning against each other in the quiet, our hands still loosely entwined. It might have been minutes, it might have been hours. All I knew was that the silence no longer felt like a weight pressing down on us. It had shifted into something lighter, softer, almost protective. Eventually he let out a breath, one that almost sounded like a laugh. "This is crazy, right?" "Yeah," I said, my lips curling without me meaning them to. "Completely." But neither of us moved. We sat side by side on the edge of my bunk, our shoulders brushing now and then, a touch that didn't feel accidental anymore. The charge that had once terrified me had softened into warmth, like the glow of embers after a fire. He tilted his head back against the wall, eyes half closed. I don't even know what happens next. The question lingered between us. I could have said something serious, something heavy, but instead the words that slipped out were lighter. "Maybe we just sit here for now." That earned a real laugh from him, quiet, genuine, the kind that made his shoulders shake just a little. "You're probably right." We fell into an easy rhythm after that, the kind I never would have imagined only a day ago. He asked me about the book he saw peeking out of my backpack and I teased him for never having heard of it. I asked about the music on his phone and he offered me one of his earbuds. The song was mellow, a slow guitar line threading through the silence. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape but to take it in fully, the music, the warmth of him beside me, the closeness that no longer scared me. When I opened my eyes again he was watching me. Not with intensity, not with pressure. Just a soft curiosity, like he was memorizing the way I looked in that moment. "What?" I asked, a little embarrassed. "Nothing," he said quickly, though his smile betrayed him. "Just, you seem different when you're not overthinking." I scoffed, nudging his shoulder with mine. "So, all the time?" "Pretty much." His grin widened, playful now, and I couldn't help but laugh with him. It was strange, how quickly the tension had turned into something so natural. There were still questions unspoken, futures unplanned, but here, in this narrow room with the faint hum of the city outside, none of that seemed urgent. At some point, his head tipped back against the wall again and mine followed. Our shoulders stayed pressed together, neither of us shifting away. His hand rested near mine on the blanket, close enough that our knuckles brushed now and then. We talked until our words started to fade into yawns and half-finished sentences. About nothing and everything. Favorite movies, old stories from childhood, little fragments we hadn't shared with anyone in years. It felt fragile, yes, but it also felt safe. When the silence finally returned, it was easy, not heavy. He tilted his head just enough that it brushed mine, a quiet gesture, unspoken but deliberate. "Where do we go from here?" he murmured, repeating his earlier question but softer this time, like he wasn't really asking for an answer. I turned slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Wherever it takes us." His eyes flicked to mine in the dim light, and a faint smile curved his lips. Not a big one, not even sure of itself, but real. And in that moment, with our shoulders pressed together and the world narrowed down to this tiny room, it felt like enough. Morning crept into the room slowly, through the thin curtain that couldn't keep the light from spilling across the walls. I stirred, the stiffness in my neck reminding me I hadn't fallen asleep properly. I drifted in and out, sitting against the wall with him at my side. At some point in the night, his head had slipped onto my shoulder. I hadn't dared to move, afraid I'd wake him, afraid I'd lose the fragile weight of him leaning against me. Now, in the pale light, I could see the curve of his lashes against his cheek, the faint rise and fall of his chest as he slept. For the first time since I'd arrived at the hostel, I didn't feel like a guest in someone else's space. The room was still the same, chipped paint, bunk beds, faint city noise leaking through the window, but with him here it felt changed. It felt ours. He stirred, shifting slightly, and then blinked his eyes open. For a second, confusion flickered across his face, like he wasn't sure where he was. Then he saw me and a slow, quiet smile spread across his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I whispered back. He straightened a little, rubbing his eyes, but didn't move away completely. The warmth of his arms still brushed mine, and I found myself reluctant to let even that small contact fade. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" he asked. I shook my head, smiling faintly. "Not really." He studied me for a moment, then reached into his bag at the foot of the bed. A small thermos appeared in his hands, battered and dented. He unscrewed the lid and poured steaming liquid into the cup that doubled as the cap. He offered it to me without a word. Coffee. Strong, bitter, and perfect. I wrapped my hands around the cup, the warmth seeping into my fingers, and took a sip. The taste grounded me, but it was the gesture, the simple act of him pouring it for me, that lingered. Thanks, I said softly. He shrugged, but his eyes were gentle. Don't mention it. The room filled with a kind of morning quiet that felt different from the night before, lighter, easier. Outside, footsteps echoed on the street, someone laughed distantly, and life moved on. But in here it felt like time had slowed again just for us. He set the thermos down and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then quietly, "You know this, whatever this is, it doesn't make sense, right?" I held the cup a little tighter, my chest tightening. "I know. But..." His voice trailed off, and when he looked at me again, there was no hesitation in his eyes. "I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." Something knotted inside me at those words. I nodded slowly. Me neither. We didn't need to say more. The unspoken things hung between us, but they didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt like promises, like the start of something fragile but real. After a moment he reached down, his hand brushing mine. It was tentative, almost shy, but deliberate. I set the cup aside and let my fingers slip into his. It was such a simple thing, holding hands. But in the bright hush of morning, it felt like everything. We sat there like that, side by side, fingers laced, while the city outside stretched awake. I thought back to the night I'd first arrived, how empty the room had felt, how I dreaded the closeness of strangers. And now, here I was, closer to someone than I'd ever expected, my chest full of a warmth I didn't know I'd been missing. He turned slightly, his voice quiet, meant only for me. "Feels like something real, doesn't it?" I met his gaze, the corners of my mouth lifting. "Yeah, it does." The curtain shifted with the morning breeze, light spilling across us in broken lines. And in that moment, with his hand in mine and the day just beginning, I realized I wasn't alone anymore.